Welcome to week 2. I hope you all are doing well. I'd just like to spend a little time talking about the Assyrians and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians began to rise up around 1800 BC, and about 1120, they moved in and they took over from the Hittites. Now, if you look at this map, you can see how the Assyrian Empire slowly grew and developed. They conquered city-states much like others had in the Fertile Crescent. And basically, the Assyrian Empire will run roughly from about 911 until 626 BC. What happens is that the Neo-Assyrians or the Assyrians, whichever you want to call them, their big mistake was that their empire got too big. And if you figure this is in an era where the fastest thing was a horse, and what of course happens is the Assyrians focus their energies in Egypt. Egypt has lots of grain, Egypt has lots of gold, and they kind of forget about what's happening back in the old Sumerian areas, and that allows the Babylonians to rise up into what will become the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now, the Neo-Babylonian Empire only lasts for from 628 until 538 BC. So we're talking a period of less than 100 years. As often happens, you have a ruler who takes over. He has a son who does a decent job. He has a son who does an okay job, and eventually it falls apart. The Neo-Babylonians kind of left us two things. One is this gate, which is very famous, and the remnants of it now lie in Berlin. It's made out of blue tile, which was very expensive at the time. And then the next thing that you need to know about the Neo-Babylonians is the gentleman over here, or I use that term loosely, King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar will rule from 605 BC until 561 BC. And the most important thing that Nebuchadnezzar will do is that there are these group of people, the Jews, who are in Palestine, and finally he gets sick of it, and he goes down to Palestine. He conquers the Jewish territory. He destroys the temple that was built by Solomon, and then he hauls the best and the brightest of the Jews back to Babylon. This is what's known as the Babylonian captivity. Now, the thing about it was that the Jews refused to submit. They refused to embrace the Babylonian gods. They held out, and what's known as the Babylonian captivity becomes an inspiration for other enslaved people, including African Americans, in the period leading up to the American Civil War. Because the idea is if the Jews could survive, then so can you. Now, to the east and north of the Babylonian Empire was the Median Empire, the Medes, or as we would come to know them eventually, the Persians. If you look, the Medes do not look that different from the Babylonians. They all are kind of using the same visual language to describe themselves. But the Mede Empire is kind of chilling on the edge of the Babylonians. And as often happens, empires get a little bit too big, people aren't paying attention, things happen. Now, the person who will connect the Babylonians with the Medes is Cyrus the Great. You'll find a lot of people in the ancient world love to be called the Great. Now, Cyrus is the gentleman on the left. What happened is the gentleman on the right was the king of the Medes, and he became convinced. His name was Astyages. He ruled from 585 to 550. He had a dream, and in that dream, his grandson killed him and overthrew his empire. So he figured, what am I going to do? Well, there was this little principality kind of southeast of Babylon, and so he figured he would marry his only daughter off to the prince, because this prince was kind of a nerdy type of person, and that would solve the problem. Well, then legend has it that he had another dream. Again, his grandson overthrew his empire. So he decided he dispatched his chief general, whose name was Harpaeus, the gentleman in the center, to kill the kid. Well, he didn't kill the kid. Instead, what he did was he basically swapped the kid out for a baby who had been stillborn. And for 10 or 11 years, Cyrus passed as just a civilian, and then the switch was discovered. And when that happened, Harpaeus's boss, the king of the Medes, got so angry that he had Harpaeus's son executed and then served up to him at dinner. Now, this is a great way of creating an enemy, because of course what happens is Cyrus now is the prince. He overthrows the Babylonian Empire and then turns around and goes to the guy who rescued him at the beginning and says, "Can you help me out?" And of course, he does. And Cyrus takes over the Medes and creates a brand new empire. Now, Cyrus was born in 600 BC, and he will rule both the Babylonian and Median Empire until he dies in 530. This empire became known as the Persian Empire, or the Archimedean Empire, if you want to be a big fan of Cyrus. Now, in order to rule this empire, Cyrus built a new capital, and this is Persepolis. This is his capital. This is the way it looks today up top, and this is the way we think it looked when he was king. This will be the capital of the Persian Empire. It's a World Heritage Site. And what's kind of interesting about it is when you look at the surviving elements, there are things that are taken from Egypt, things that are taken from Babylonia, and things that are taken from Median culture. Now, in order to rule this empire, Cyrus relied on 20 regional governors. And these regional governors were oftentimes people picked from the community who agreed to be loyal to the Persians. They were known as satraps. And it was through these regional governors that he was able to control such a vast empire. And in fact, as the Persian Empire flips to different people, like for example, when it's conquered by Alexander the Great, the satraps are kept because it's an excellent way of maintaining order. Now, the thing that is probably the most important thing that comes out of the Persian Empire is the Zoroastrian religion. The Zoroastrian religion is kind of a unique religion in the ancient world. Most religions are multi-god, with the exception of the Jews. The Zoroastrians believed that there were actually two gods. The good god was known as Ahura Mazda, and the bad god was Agramanu. Now, the name for the religion, so we see Ahura Mazda at the top and Agramanu at the bottom, and in the center we have Zarathustra. Zarathustra was the prophet for Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was the god of good, the god of virtue, the god of honesty, whereas Agramanu was the god of evil, much like the devil. And in fact, historians suggest that the concept of the devil in kind of modern culture comes from this individual, because of course when the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, they inherited the Jews, and in fact Cyrus will be the one who allows the Jews to return to Israel, because from his perspective, they worship one God, I worship one God. Well, there's a bad one, and I don't want to think about him, but still, there was a commonality which allowed the Jews to benefit within the Persian Empire. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that Cyrus will eventually die, but he is great, and this is, in fact, his tomb. And while the Iranians obviously are no longer Zoroastrians, and in fact, they've done their best to stamp out the religion, they still honor Cyrus. In fact, this is a military ceremony being held by the Republican Guard from Iran today to celebrate Cyrus and his victories over the rest of the known world.